and welcome to National Herald. I'm Rukmini Sen. Locked down, trapped and abandoned migrant workers in Pune city. A survey of workers in Pune city who were waiting to go back home after the national lockdown was first announced in March 2020 describes their distress and living conditions. Its findings provide significant insights on what migrant workers need and what the policy decisions regarding them should consider. Joining me is Dr. Anuradha Kalhan, teacher of economics, who was associated with a team that facilitated and supported migrant workers going back home safely from Pune. Dr. Kalhan later got associated with this survey and wrote about this in the Economic and Political Weekly. Dr. Kalhan, welcome. Welcome to National Herald.
Thank you, Rukmini, for having me and being part of that team.
Thank you very much. Well, my first question to you is, tell us a little about your engagement with the migrant workers in Pune last year. What was the exact work you did? And I am aware that there were trade unions like C2 and there were multiple volunteers who were involved. Tell us a little about what was happening at that point of time.
We all know the suddenness of it caught us and everybody by a big surprise. Nobody expected it. And since my days in Mumbai, now I have been associated with trade unions. And when I happened to find myself in Pune at that time, I have been in touch with the trade unions in Pune. So there was a call put out by CITU. Some of their leaders are close friends of mine, and I immediately jumped into it, quite realizing the kind of horror that was unfolding. Some of it was captured very brilliantly by journalists who jumped in with their videos, So I've also actually, for the first time in my life, footnotes or my references include video uploads that were occurring through that period. And the people who went back on foot were obviously, I don't know, it's undescribable horror. Probably everybody knows it's. My father was actually mentioning, who was 86, that never seen anything like this since the partition, and he was part of that. The refugees who came out of Pakistan. He was born there and was living there. So the history that we were seeing making or unmaking was right in front of us. It was impossible to stay away, and I volunteered. And I was handling that group that was almost entirely connected on phone. There was nothing else. So the volunteers were calling, workers whose list we had prepared through the CITU offices. And that's why there is a selection bias even in that sample, because bulk of them were known to CITU, even though they were informal sector workers. And it's through them we got to know other workers and other workers and other workers. And the sample eventually of the workers we contacted went into maybe 590 odd at that particular point, at that particular one phase in May, when it became evident that trains would begin and they would need to be helped to get into the trains. So the workers we caught at that point were the ones who chose to stay back and not walk off. I'm sure that the ones who went away, we will never have their story.
So the survey that you did later, if you could tell us, what did you find in them about the condition of the workers who stayed back? And did the government, which should be my first question, I guess, did the government in any way support them?
No, the title of the thing is actually evident. They were locked down, they were trapped where they were, and they were abandoned. Their employers helped them for about a few weeks by giving them food or money sometimes. And then even they realized they also abandoned them, because it seemed like an indefinite period over which they would have to support hundreds, maybe more workers. So hundreds of workers, or at least multiple workers at various sites. So they absolutely tragically, despite the great appeals made by none other than our Prime Minister that the employers should look after their employees, it didn't happen. And when we got them, on phone. They were dire straits. Most of them didn't have food. They had run out of money. They said food supply for a couple of days or maybe a few, that's all they had. And so the union then eventually, the volunteers of the union, CITU, got involved in delivering food. And many of them would just make these parcels, and we had donation drives. Some friends and people donated. CITU used its own money, perhaps also. Then we distributed food.
It was a citizen initiative. I'm sorry if cutting in, but so this was largely a citizen initiative.
I think the CITU called it, and then the volunteers stepped in. So it's a joint. It's actually the leadership came from there, and then we pitched in. All of us just pitched in, and people who knew how it's going to play out just took a more central role. So I was handling the phone part and the messaging that would come and the replying to what's to be done. And Kiran, of course, was the main organizer of the data lists that were coming out, what is their number and where are they from? So who is going to look after that segment, because language is an issue. So the Bengalis needed help from a Bengali and so on and so forth. So that from her end, she was doing the bigger logistic thing, and I was handling their queries from here. And must add to the misery I was in, because at that point, the internet connection in my home, which is literally very close to Hinjewadi, which is the IT sector of India, just broke. So I was using phone data and, stepping out under trees and doing this work. So it's quite memorable, in every way it captures the situation in the country. It couldn't be fixed because of the lockdown.
Who were these workers largely? Maharashtra has lots of workers from all over the country.
I think it's the biggest sort of user of migrant workers is Maharashtra in sheer numbers. Most of them were construction workers. Good 2/3 of them roughly were construction workers in various sites. If you're aware that we are into the smart city syndrome. So there were lots of construction sites all over, and there is a big and small construction going on everywhere. And then a bunch of them were, housekeeping and self-employed housekeeping staff, self-employed personnel, and transportation workers. It's quite a big spectrum that we got, but bulk of them were construction.
The ones who were on, say, monthly wage contract, what about their dues, their income? Were they being paid by their employers? The employers taking care of them? Because there was a directive, an instruction from the Prime Minister's office that everybody should be paid, and no worker should be unpaid, and they should not lose their jobs. What was the ground reality as you saw it?
There was no lockdown wage. There was some kind of assistance during, like 500 rupees given to a bunch of workers, ek hafta ka khana lene ke liye kind of money. And that's it. By the time we met them we started contacting them in May, they were in dire straits. They had hardly 100 rupees in their pocket. That's it. They had finished their savings. Many of them had asked people from home to send them money so as to be able to get their tickets to go, and or to pay for some of the expenses in case they didn't get any free tickets. We didn't know at that time whether it would be free or paid. It was horrific. They had nothing. Food for a couple of days, and they were eating maybe, in some camps, they were eating puffed rice for a couple of days before we caught them. It was quite dire. It was something that no civilized society should be, witnessing that close firsthand.
So the people who stayed back, there were some people who went out, they walked, we saw those visuals. These people who stayed back, did they stay back on their own? Did did you have to convince them to stay back? People who waited, why did they wait?
I think there were quite a few reasons looking back. Some of them were just most of them were from too far away, like West Bengal, Tripura. Walking and going on foot was not an option. The second thing is they were not too clear on when it would be lifted and how things would pan out. Third is they had a lot of dues pending. You see, it's amazing that over half of them claimed there was some money pending with the employer. So they thought they would lose that money if they just left. So there were a range of reasons. And yes, that's the kind of reasons they gave us. That's the reason. That's the kind of reasons they gave us.
And then the train started. Tell us, what did you have to really engage with the government? What happened with the train? How did the train suddenly start eventually? And then who bought the tickets? If the tickets were bought, was the service for free? What about the food on the way home, on the way back home? How was all that managed?
We were waiting and waiting and waiting for the permission for the trains to start, convincing them on the margin that don't set forth on foot at such great distances. There's a great danger to you, physical danger. So there was a little bit of convincing required, but the situation got desperate as the days passed, and there was some indecision from the center as to when the trains will be allowed and in which direction, where would they be going. Well, Maharashtra government then announced that they would start. A date seemed to be, date was announced, and then it was going to be free. So then a lot of workers wanted those online bookings. Now, everything needed to be online, and they were not in a situation where they had that connectivity. So the union helped them in getting those tickets, in seeing off some contingents of workers. Some of our comrades were actually also at the station to see them off and things like that. But the details of food and all, I think, were just the workers made their own arrangements. It was impossible for us as a union to create some kind of food parcels at the short notice and the general chaos and logistic thing that was going on. So they would come to the station and, just get into the specified trains and leave with best wishes, with their own arrangements. That's it.
And then you tried contacting them, right? You tried contacting them to understand how were they doing? Did they reach? How many people did you manage to contact? What were your findings there?
We didn't contact them soon after they left. We didn't do that. We waited, and they had our numbers, so if there was distress, we would have got calls. The fact that no news is good news is that they probably got to where they were supposed to get. Then, as the anniversary of the lockdown approached, somewhere in February, I had this notion, and I put it to CITU, some CITU leaders, that can we use this thing to call them back? And it was readily agreed to, but we had no volunteers to do that. At the time of the first lockdown, everybody was trapped in Pune, and then a huge number of volunteers were generated, and everybody was the same location, so connectivity wasn't a problem. This time we had to sort of put up requests for volunteers, and the response was slow and took a while, but we got students. So Symbiosis Institute, School of Economics, where I think that the main team came entirely from there, three students, and they generated further on the social media, etc., a call. And so some 10 or 11 volunteers, but this time they were thrown. The students were also trapped in different parts of the country. So we had students from Kerala and students in Assam and students in Rajasthan. Nobody was in Pune. And the lists were given to them and they divided it based on, I think, their language comfort, basically. So the Hindi speaking and the Bangla speaking and the others. And then they started calling. See, they were trying to call these workers, and they would have very poor luck. The numbers would sometimes not be the ones that were originally belonged to that name. Then also the connection, they would ring, nobody would answer. And then someone, when a few would answer, they would know. So, but what are we going to get from this survey? And most of them didn't have time to talk. I think they just didn't have that, because when you're doing a survey, you need 10, 15 minutes of unbroken connectivity and time, on the other side and your side should match. So when the students started coming back with this feedback that it's not happening in the way we thought it would, I said, well, let's not be as ambitious as we set out to be. We had 580, 590 in the first phone list. Let's just try to get some. And by the time we were into March, the infections were picking up. There was some end of, by April, there was an about turn and workers were going right back. So we had called off the survey because it was just confounding the whole thing. We were not making any sense. We got some 63 odd responses. By then we had filled up forms and uploaded them. And based on those 63, a little picture emerged, though it's not really truly representative of the entire sample that we had earlier. I think it's reasonably representative, not entirely reasonable, but it is. I found it was reasonable, good picture of what had happened to them after they left. That's what we were trying to find out.
And what did you find out? Out of those 60 people, what were their stories more or less?
Where should we begin? So let's say that over half of them experienced periods of unemployment. And since they had almost depleted their savings even before they left here, about 1 out of every 4 person had a loan that they had taken. From friends and family was the most common source, and then some from banks, some from LIC, some from something. That was the second thing that I learned. The third thing that upset me was that the majority of them said that their consumption of food remained the same. 18% of them said their consumption of food declined. And you compare it to what they were living on in Pune before they left, 2 months before they left, and somebody telling you that it actually fell from that point, 18%, it's significant. It's significant. So yes, about a fifth, about 5% of them mentioned that their children, they had to take them out of school. Many of them just ended up saying things like, but it doesn't really matter because nothing is happening in schools and it's all online. And but it was some small sort of consolation, but they were that. And of course, there were women who had sold assets, some gold, somebody's mobile sold, somebody's two-wheeler sold in the village, etc. There was that. And then it was another interesting fact that when they were leaving, we asked them that, what will you do when you go to the village? So because we had a largish sample from Bengal, we have a disproportionately large sample in our worker sample, about 36-37% who had their own land in Bengal, however small. So they said they'd work on the land. A lot of them said that they'll do that, and they'll do odd jobs, whatever. They'll work on somebody else's land, also help out for wages. And hardly 1.3% of them said they would do NREGA work. These are people all over Bihar, Jharkhand, everywhere, of that entire sample. And when we actually looked at the data now, 10% of them ended up going to NREGA. So NREGA is the last resort. And Rukmani, you must remember, these are skilled and semi-skilled labor from Pune, who are 36-37% of them are 10th standard and above. These are not your old school dropouts fourth standard, zero schooling kind of people. There are very few in that with zero schooling. 37% are 10th standard and above. I've rarely seen this kind of, in my years of looking at informal and formal sector labor, this kind of distribution. That such a sample, such a set of workers should be working for such a pittance, 15,000 and less in a city where you know what the cost of living, rent, etc. is, and that money was being sent home. It was not their money. So in an average, 3 to 5 people depending on that salary, on that money, and on top of all of it, past dues from the employer. So what picture does it paint? That the entire labor market is in doldrums. That's workers are compelled to work under such circumstances. I think it was a complete and eye-opening, shattering picture of what the situation is like as far as labor markets are concerned. And I want to add that it is not only COVID.
So one thing that you suggested is that there is a need for urgent transfer of money in the accounts of the labor force of India. And because otherwise we are risking their life, and we're risking the life of the people they live with also, because there is no healthcare in the rural areas. What is the other recommendation that you made that we must do?
That a village-based district and village-based grasp of what is possible in NREGA without jeopardizing the health of the people, without creating a super spreaders in that particular locality, will have to be done. And you need more health experts taking a decision at that level.
So you're saying create employment in rural areas without keeping in mind that the risk to life is reduced as much as possible.
Yeah.
Right? Now, as an economist, I want to ask you, where do you see us by the end of 2021?
The economists would love to talk about another very sharp rebound in economic growth rate. And so it was supposed to be 11, but it won't be 11% GDP. It will be 9% GDP. Those numbers don't mean anything, Rukmani, to the very large, the bottom of the pyramid right now.
Population, you mean? It will mean something in terms of...
Yeah, the whole base I'm talking about, those 372 informally employed, they get jobs as trickle down from some big infrastructure construction projects, right? Those really actually have problem not stopped per se right now. They are going on, not at the speed that they were, but some work is going on. But I doubt if that, as an economist, you say, oh, maybe we'll recover to 9% or 8%. Doesn't mean anything for livelihoods. It means nothing for livelihoods. It means nothing for these millions to 230 million who are going to sink into poverty, those 100 million who are like circulating in search for jobs. So yes, I mean, IT sector is doing well, and the pharmaceutical sector will do very well also. And the healthcare industry will make a lot of profit out of this pandemic, which is obvious. The hospitals will do well. And banking and finance in the stock market. But these are minuscule employers of our population. They are not livelihood, sustainers. So where do the people actually live, and how do they live? And there are two different Indias. There are two very different Indias. And the bottom is the bigger part in numbers, much bigger and larger in numbers. And I can't see a society that is, I'm not going to talk about the economy. It will survive. Of course, it will survive. It'll probably recover to 9 and 8 and 9. But I can't see a society surviving such a vast, great deprivation that has occurred. It cannot survive. This society as it exists cannot.
And what does economy mean if it doesn't talk about livelihood of the masses, right? I mean,
it just doesn't, it's becoming an abstraction of some profit and some strange calculation that economists are also thriving on, and particularly the ones that are employed by banks and by rating agencies and by credit agencies. They keep talking about how quickly the GDP will bunch up, and how it does, of course, matter to that 10% of workforce that is in the organized sector, and the few who get a trickle down from that. But in the face of the fact that such a large dislocation has occurred and has been slip sliding since demonetization, it is 4 years.
Okay, my last question, and I think I should ask you this question. Why not just COVID-19, this pandemic or other epidemics in past, what is wrong with the way we are designing our economy? Because clearly, COVID or no COVID, it doesn't help the poorest of the poor in this country, right? So how are we supposed to design it? And where have we gone wrong repeatedly? Because whenever there is a crisis, the rich seem to survive it, at least in terms of monies, but the poor have nowhere to go. And the fact that when the help doesn't come, it doesn't really drastically change anything in the country even after that. So what is going wrong with the country and the way we are planning our economy and the life of our people?
I don't know where to begin that story, but it is a really deep-seated sort of trajectory onto which India has walked. It's not a recent crisis. It's not something that's emerged now. It's been happening particularly more since we had neoliberal reforms in India, and the whole accent on profit translating into reinvestment for growth. So the whole accent has shifted. The whole stress has shifted onto growth, economic measured in monetary terms, with surplus being generated through profits. And as a result of that, what does it mean to the life of the bulk of the people is lost? So it's somebody else's agenda, this growth and this, if you grow at that rate, then, a small percentage of jobs will be created, and some more informally employed will get some crumbs, a trickle down will occur. That's a trickle down theory, which is which was the flavor of our times, at least the times that we all grew up as young adults, and that has failed so obviously to touch the lives of people. And I'm beginning to think that a whole new way of thinking about the economy and people has to come out of this COVID crisis, and there should be sectors which are protected from just emphasis on profit maximization. They should be sustainable sectors that you can sustain yourself, but a vast number of people will have to be employed at, I think, perhaps lower wages, but life sustaining wages that they can sustain. A public sector that gives them healthcare, public sector that gives them education and gives them a sense of security, so that they don't move like scavengers, hunters for jobs across the country. And that sector has to be recognized as not being for profit. It is sustaining livelihoods, sustaining lives. And I think a realization that socially, politically, you're going to collapse if you create so many desperate people. You can't survive. You just can't. This neoliberal model doesn't work in countries like ours, where there's no end to the poverty and the precariousness of people's lives. You can't compare it to a developed country.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was Anuradha Kalhan, Dr. Anuradha Kalhan with us. And what she said, and what I understood from it, is that economy, just economic growth, talk of economic growth doesn't mean anything, because economy is all about livelihood of people. Till people have food, health, education, everything is okay. If they don't have it, then however much your GDP is, it doesn't make any difference to the people of this country. Thank you again. Thank you very much for joining us. You're watching National Herald. If you like the video, please like, share, and subscribe.